Thank you. Hey, everyone. Um, so, when I was asked to present something for this uh, conference, I figured out that I don't usually have opinions about specific surahs, and it's more of a general thing. And I had to figure out, what I want to talk about. And this actually came up as an idea, and I think it actually fits quite nicely with the things we've been talking about, which is good. Um, and this paper kind of came together through discussions at ICSA with Haytham Sidki, who I should mention here. 2 years ago at ICSA, there was a talk by Chris Mesger, who tried to do something with Kaplony's documentary hypothesis and biblical citations in relation to that. And that made me wonder whether it really works. And maybe slight spoilers, I don't think it does. But let's first talk a little bit about this. So Andreas Kaplony wrote, I think, a very thought-provoking article where he first makes the observation that Quranic surahs kind of look like what he calls kitab documents. These are very typical papyri, and this is what's nice about having a papyrologist look at the Quran and suddenly see something that I don't think other people have quite grokked. These kitab documents are letters, and they're a specific genre of papyri that start with a basmala, as many letters do, and then start with something like هذا الكتاب إلى فلان من فلان, right? And then start with the content. So this is kind of the introduction. It's quite a simple formula, but there are also ways of not doing it like that, right? And he says, well, that kind of looks like a surah, right? Which also starts with the basmala, and then starts with ذلك الكتاب or تلك آيات, etc. And it's like, well, is there something going on there? There may be other ways of thinking about that too. I must say, I kind of like, this was Adam Flowers who pointed out that very often when you get these tilka ayat things, actually there's muqata'at in front of it, and maybe those are the ayat they're talking about, and then this whole thing falls apart. But the observation, I think, is quite interesting. And I don't think that version of the story quite works completely either. But from that point, okay, so clearly these were separate documents. That's kind of his starting point. He figured, well, then let's have a look. Is there anything to these different documents that are the surahs? And he comes up with a kind of documentary hypothesis and says, well, there's basically three groups. One group that contains most of the surahs, and then there are two minority groups. One minority group that has a specific term for God, that is Ar-Rahmān, a specific muqata'at, so a specific word for heaven, and a specific word for hell. And then also another minority group, somewhat bigger, that uses Rabb al-ʿālamīn as a name for God, certain other, although somewhat overlapping, mysterious letters, and different words for heaven and hell. And then there's a hegemonic group, which are surahs that I guess don't start with muqata'at and have these terms like al-Jannah, as we know, and Allah, of course, for God, and Jahannam and Nar. And Kaplony isn't saying that these terms of the hegemonic group are not also used in these smaller groups, but is saying that these are somewhat isolated groups. And if these things are documents, and he even argues that these muqata'at might be addresses or some kind of way of cataloging these documents, which I really don't think works, but that's okay. And these would maybe be from different places. Now, why I thought I could talk about this at this conference is, well, at least 5 of them, of the 7 long ones, show up in one of his minority groups. So could it be that the 7 long ones are all, or 5 of them, part of this group that actually calls God Rabb al-ʿālamīn? Now, I thought this was really cool. It's really a kind of documentary hypothesis, and is initially attractive for a couple of reasons. First of all, because these names for gods actually have some amount of geographic distribution. So Rabb al-ʿālamīn is very similar to what we see in Aramaic, Marijn al-Ma, right? And we saw this inscription earlier already with Ilka's presentation. This is clearly a Jewish inscription, and it's using the Aramaic equivalent of Rabb al-ʿālamīn, more technically Rabb al-ʿālam, but let's give that room here. So that's up in the north. This is northern Hijaz, right? This is the Tabuk region. And down south, as we've known for some time, it is good to know, we get Rahmanan as the name for God, not just in kind of general monotheistic inscriptions, but we get them in quite clearly Christian inscriptions as well, right? So here we have the Trinity with Rahmanan, his Masih, and the Ruh Qudus. That's cool. And Abraha being mentioned, right? Everything. Oh, there we go. Clearly there's something kind of Christian to using Rahmanan, at least in a very consistent way. I have a weird moon over here. I'm not sure what happened there, but whatever. And then in the Hijaz itself, we really now have a bunch of really nice inscriptions, like in the central Hijaz, let's say, really nice inscriptions that clearly call God Allah. Spelled in the Quranic way with two lams, which is actually somewhat relevant and important. And so what we see in the Quran is kind of this bringing together, this marrying of these different terms, the name for God from the central Hijaz itself, the name for God at least used by some Jews in the north, and the name for God used at least by some Christians, and probably quite a few Christians in the south, into this single text. And this is, of course, somewhat reminiscent of the documentary hypothesis as we see with the Pentateuch, where we have, Elohim and the Tetragrammaton coming together in some interesting ways. And the Quran really seems to be doing something with this, right? So in Al-Fatiha, the three names of God are literally right after one another. And of course, also in the Basmala, these things are brought together, at least to some extent. And we even have some ayahs that try to harmonize this, right? Where the Quran basically says, well, you can invoke, God, Allah, or you can invoke Ar-Rahmān. Whatever you do, it's still good, and he has the most beautiful names. So are these three blocks that are kind of brought together in the Quran, and the Quran is indeed a kind of, collection of different documents with different deities? Well, that's the big question. Does it work? And I don't think it does. So if we really start looking at these correlations, it really becomes quite problematic. There's not a single surah that has all three Rahmanic terms for God, heaven, and hell. So we have three that have Ar-Rahmān together with Jannat Adn. We have three others that have Ar-Rahmān and al-Sa'ir, and then we have one that combines Jannat Adn and al-Sa'ir. It's slightly better for the Rabbic surahs, as I'm calling them for now. So we have four that actually use all three of those terms. And we have two more that only have two of the terms. That's not much to conclude a correlation, especially not if you look at these pretty long lists of surahs which are supposed to be part of these groups. It's sometimes a little difficult to reconstruct like how these groups even came together in Kaplony's table, as we'll see in a bit. Now, so Kaplony says in one group of surahs, heaven is called Jannat Adn, and hell is called As-Sa'ir, whereas in another group, heaven is named the Gardens of Na'im, and hell is named Jahim. But actually, Jannat Adn co-occurs more with the Arabic term Jahim than it does with the Rahmanic term As-Sa'ir. Twice versus one, which is both not a lot, but it's something. And okay, so Na'im definitely shows up more with the Arabic term for hell, but it actually still co-occurs 4 times with the Rahmanic term. By what criterion are these two groups made? I'm not really sure. And the logic is not so easy to reconstruct, and I think Kaplony even has some trouble reconstructing his own reasoning, because at some point he tells me that, or us, that Ar-Rahmān and Jahannam are correlated, and someone else noted that already, but he's not saying these are correlated, he's saying these are not correlated. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. some more things. What else can we say about this? I'm also going to look at time. So the split is not so great, even though Kaplony says all three terms are combined in one surah, surah 1 only, which is not true. They actually occur in a bunch of other ones. And he admits this himself, so I don't know what he means by this. Maybe he means that only in Surah 1, all three of them are right in a row next to each other, but I can't quite reconstruct what he's saying there. On a purely formal level, the correlation between the terms that Kaplony observes is not very well supported by the evidence. Another issue is, for example, the ḥawāmīm. I think we would all want to agree that if we're going to put documents together from different sources, we want the ḥawāmīm to be from a single source. But Kaplony's division, if corrected, cuts right across the ḥawāmīm. So to Kaplony, all of these are Rabb al-ʿālamīn surahs, except 42, which is somehow in both groups. But if you actually look at the terms, so these are the Rahmanic terms for God, heaven, and hell, and the Rabb al-ӓlamīn terms for God, heaven, and hell. And as you can see, 46 has none of those terms, so I'm not sure how it got to be put in any group at all. 42 only has the Rahmanic word for hell and nothing else, but it's somehow in both. This one only has Ar-Rahmān and none of the other terms, but still somehow in Rabb al-ʿālamīn. So I don't know, I really don't know what happened here, and it's really difficult to reconstruct. I think what seems to have happened is that anything that started with ḥāmīm, except if it started with ḥāmīm Ayn Sin Qaf, was put into the Rabb al-ʿālamīn group, and only on that basis. That's not a correlation, that's just, grouping things. So if you would correct it, I think you get something like this. Rabb al-ʿālamīn, Rahmān, maybe, question mark. And then Rabb al-ʿālamīn, and then Allah, I suppose. So that's not great. Another question we might ask is, are these names interchangeable? If these are really different terms for God, you would hope that they function as names of God, so to speak. As in, if you have Allah, you should be able to replace it with Ar-Rahmān, or you should be able to replace that with Rabb al-ʿālamīn and basically get a sensible reading, or the other way around. So let's try and do that. So if we do that with Rabb al-ʿālamīn, we get in trouble. Rabb al-ʿālamīn occurs 42 times. Every single time it occurs in verse final rhyme. Obviously, you can't put Ar-Rahmān in verse final position because, well, then it doesn't rhyme anymore. Nor can you put Allah in that place. That would break the rhyme. Clearly, this is a formula, a term, a name for God, an epithet for God maybe, that is used to create the rhyme. And quite often it co-occurs with Allah. This is not quite in conflict with Kaplony's hypothesis, but I still think it's important that we actually have a lot of cases where Allah is being put next to Rabb al-ʿālamīn. So Rabb al-ʿālamīn is there to modify Allah and not to replace Allah, right? The same is of course true with an-Naʿīm and al-Jaḥīm, which also rhyme. And the fact that these co-occur with Rabb al-ʿālamīn at all is not so surprising, considering that these words also, basically all, so an-Naʿīm only occurs in rhyme, al-Jaḥīm mostly occurs in rhyme, form the rhyme for the surahs. So these are rhyme terms, and these are rhyme synonyms for heaven and hell that you can use in rhyme, where otherwise you couldn't. And you even see cases where this is quite clearly done, right? So this تَجْرِي مِن تَحْتِهِمُ الْأَنْهَارُ, we know this very well, right? And usually the Jannat is at the top, but now it's at the end and finishes up the rhyme. Very nice. So compare that to these, right, where that's not the case. So clearly there's a movement of the noun phrase to make up the rhyme. Clearly this is the rhyme. Oh, that was a bit loud. There's a couple of cases where Jaḥīm doesn't rhyme, so okay. But then it sometimes co-occurs with a hegemonic group, the Allahic words for heaven. I don't think this is great. Rhyme really is the obvious explanation here. The reason why Rabb al-ʿālamīn, and indeed the words for heaven and hell, do not co-occur with other terms, in as far as that is true, is because these terms are used to form the rhyme, a place in which these other terms could not stand. There's also the correlation that we see with the muqata'at should also be explained through rhyme, I think. Devon Stewart observed some time ago now already that most of the time the muqata'at actually seem to set the rhyme. I think of these as a kind of a musical key. Alif lam mim and hey mim, tay mim, tay sin mim all give this kind of in, un, im, un rhyme. There's a bunch of non-rhyming muqata'at, especially the alif lam re group. But actually, even though all of these, I think purely on the basis that there's alif lam re in them, well, all of these are in the Rabb al-ʿālamīn group. Only one actually has any Rabb al-ʿālamīn terms at all, and that's Surah 10. So, okay, they're non-rhyming, but they also don't have any of the terms to actually put them in that group. We really need to use rhyme as an explanation here. Yeah. Also, one other non-rhyming one, that's alif lam mim sad, which only occurs in Q7. So we can also try to interchange Ar-Rahmān, of course, with Allah and these kinds of things. And this is actually slightly easier. Ar-Rahmān is more properly different from Rabb al-ʿālamīn, which is very much a kind of epithet or almost an extra phrase you put behind Allah or to replace Allah or to rhyme instead of Allah. Ar-Rahmān is more properly a independent name. So it hardly ever takes up rhyme position, only in Surat Ar-Rahmān, in its one occurrence. And therefore much more readily interchangeable. Sometimes part of a rhyme formula, right? So we have the Rahman Rahim, and then we have im rhyme, and you can also rhyme with Rabb al-ʿālamīn if you like. And it's, of course, explicitly contrasted with Allah, right? Once again, this kind of controversy that seems to have existed, that at least some of the audience of the Quran was not happy with apparently Ar-Rahman being used instead of Allah. It's okay. Rhyme is not the answer here. That's good. And that's probably not true for, well, that's certainly not true for the terms for heaven and hell either. But what's interesting, especially about this Janat Aden, like even though Ar-Rahman might show up in some of the surahs where Janat Aden is used, if you actually look at the closer context, it's Allah that's showing up, right, in these terms, within the same verse. One time, that's Surat Maryam, we actually get Ar-Rahman, and actually in a quite parallel verse, right, about the promise of what God does, and here the deity is called Ar-Rahman, here he's called Allah, and they talk about the Gardens of Eden. Same as Sa'ir clearly is used as a kind of rhyming option to use Jahannam, right? So Jahannam is then followed by Sa'ir to finish out the rhyme. Again, this term usually is invoked together with Allah, at least within the same verse. And I think that kind of proximal context is probably more relevant than the surah-wide context. If we're going to say that there's some kind of relationship between Ar-Rahman and As-Sa'ir, I think I'd want to see Ar-Rahman being used with As-Sa'ir within the verse and not another name of God. I think Kaplony would probably feel differently about that, and that's okay. We can think about that more broadly. So, for the Rahmanic surahs, rhyme cannot explain the use of Ar-Rahman very well. I don't think there's any good evidence that the associated terms of heaven and hell have anything to do with Rahmanic surahs. But it is really a separate term that is kind of striking. It is specifically the Rahmanic surahs that actually use Rahman a lot, that actually hardly use any of these terms. So I'm really not inclined to think that Janat Aden and As-Sa'ir have anything to do with the name Ar-Rahman. But still, I think Ar-Rahman, there's something going on here. Is there something to Ar-Rahman? That's kind of what I want to ask and get into slightly more speculative direction, and see how you feel about it. So we can't just dismiss, Ar-Rahman over Allah on formal grounds. There's no, basis in rhyme to do one or the other, except in Surat Ar-Rahman, but okay, that's only once. And the Quran itself really seems to be concerned with his name, right? Well, we saw this verse a couple of times already, but we have other cases as well, right? So, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ أُشْهِدُوا لِلرَّحْمَنِ قَالُوا وَمَا رَحْمَنِ. And that's clearly, there's some kind of issue here. Some of the audience seems to have been quite annoyed by this term Ar-Rahman on two occasions, and I think less explicitly there's also at least a real attempt to equate Ar-Rahman with Allah in that verse. Also the Basmala, of course, which also connects these. So there's a real concern with this name for God. And this has, of course, been observed. I mean, it's not the first time. I'm not saying anything new to any of you. Nildeko, of course, already noticed this. But I don't think we've quite resolved what's going on here. And that's kind of what I want to push back against. I think there's something to be saved in Kaplony's article with this Ar-Rahman thing, especially in Surat Maryam. So Surat Maryam is really striking because Ar-Rahman is all over that surah, and almost twice as much as Allah. And especially in verse 1 to 74, which has a very funky rhyme, as we all know, except for a rather obvious interpolation, which if we take it out, we get rid of two more Allahs. Has interesting themes, quite Christian themes, maybe anti-Christian themes, but there's something going on there, which I really think we need to do something with. And then after this portion, we once again get a rhyme switch. Is that an interpolation? Who knows? We can talk about these layers. I think we can really get rid of 34 to 40. The stuff after that, not so much. The stuff after that is still very much concerned with Christ's nature, and especially disabusing people who are calling God Ar-Rahman, that Jesus is God. But still very explicitly using Ar-Rahman, right? It's talking to an audience to whom the name Ar-Rahman is familiar, which is different from these other verses that we were talking to, where clearly there's an audience that is quite bothered by Ar-Rahman. Surat Maryam is not talking to that audience. It's not talking to the people who are like, what's this Rahman? The people that Surat Maryam is talking to clearly know who Ar-Rahman is. And that's just, because I don't want to make the same mistake as Kaplony and think there's something special to it when there's no correlations. I did some really basic statistics. So one thing I did was divide the amount of Ar-Rahmans that show up across I divided the letters in the surah through the amount of Rahmans, and what you get then is actually that the highest incidence of Rahmans per letter in a surah is Surah 1, but okay, that's so short, I think we can throw that out. And then we have Surat Maryam, right? Every 256 letters, we get a Ar-Rahman, which is really quite distinct from quite a few other surahs that have Ar-Rahman in it, although not so different from some of these. And also the relative frequency of Ar-Rahman to Allah. Surat Maryam is really quite striking. Once again, not the highest. I mean, here, there's only 2 incidences and a 0 incidence of Allah, so they technically have an infinite amount of Rahmans for Allah. And 43 is actually higher. But the number of times that it shows up, that's really quite striking, even though Allah shows up quite a bit in that as well. So I think it's reasonable to think that there's something special to Maryam and its use of Ar-Rahman. And of course, there's more things to Maryam that are kind of unusual. Maryam has a unique rhyme in this ayya, iyya, not employed anywhere else in the Quran. And it even ends up doing things linguistically that are quite special. So if you take fa'ul verbal nouns of the tertiary wow nouns, Usually in the Quran, those become fa'u, right? So ghudu, alu, utu. But then we get to Surat Maryam, we actually get ati, uti, depending on the reading, which is actually the same word as this, yeah? But all of a sudden it has a different form. Jifi doesn't show up anywhere else in the Quran. But nevertheless, once again, it would be a final waw noun, and it has a final ya, which it shouldn't have according to the grammar of the rest of the Quran. We could, of course, call that poetic license and say, well, okay, there's nothing to see here, there's no, this is not weird. But you could also say, well, maybe this is a slightly different language, still Arabic, of course, with a slightly different context, where clearly Ar-Rahmān is a more relevant name of a deity. This is not the only linguistic theme, although I think it's the most striking one. Another one is that in terms of the verbal noun of fasting, the Quran usually uses siyam, but then in Surat Maryam it uses sawm. Now, you can argue a little bit, is it the same type of fasting? Maybe there's something else going on. This isn't much. These are the most striking things, I think, that are there to Surat Maryam. I certainly would not want to argue, look, Surat Maryam comes from a different documentary source than the rest of the Quran purely on the linguistic things. But I think the high incidence of Ar-Rahmān really needs an explanation, and then we have at least some supplementary material for this. So, to kind of conclude, Kaplony's maximalist groupings really give the wrong impression. So, for example, of the Alif Lam Re surahs, only Surah 10 actually has any of the Rabb al-ʿālamīn terms for God, and still it is put into the Rabb al-ʿālamīn group. On what basis? Well, and all the other ones are put in there too, right? So 11, 12, 14, and 15 are put in there, seemingly purely on the basis that they have Alif Lam Re in it, and one of the Alif Lam Re surahs was put into that group. I don't think we should do that. I think a slightly more conservative way of grouping these things together would have made a more compelling case, but then you wouldn't have very big groups left. You would have, about 5 surahs for each. Rabb al-ʿālamīn group really isn't a group. It's best explained as the use of rhyme, hence the title of my paper. But the Rahmanic surahs defy such a structural analysis. And especially in Surat Maryam, although maybe you can think it out of other surahs as well, but Maryam really stands out to me. Allah is nearly absent, and Ar-Rahmān is all over the place, really salient. And this really cannot be a coincidence. Is it, or it is, drawing on a pre-Quranic Rahmanid Christian composition, and then speaking to a Rahmanid Christian audience, or both? I don't know, but I don't think we can pretend like this text is not speaking to something specific. I think there's something going on, and in light of the controversy of using this term, who is this surah talking to, and what are the other ayahs that are talking about this controversy talking to? That's basically all I had to say about this. I ended up talking about Surat Maryam a lot, which has nothing to do with the 7 long surahs, but I hope you understood it in the spirit that I meant it. Thank you.